Hey guys, thanks for clicking on the video. Before it begins, I just want to let you know that my mic might sound a little weird because I was messing around with some settings, so if it sounds weird, that's why. Enjoy the video. Also, join my Discord, links in the description. Once upon a time, in the year 520, there was a great island, and within this circle-shaped island, there were three different kingdoms. There was the Empire of Shatiria, the Kingdom of Wagogia, and the Kingdom of Niroga. All of these kingdoms were roughly equal in both size and population, and despite this, every single kingdom had a distinct hatred of one another, for seemingly no reason. Now, while each kingdom had a hatred of one another, they would never dare declare war on any of the other kingdoms, as here's what would happen. If one of them declared war on another kingdom, the third kingdom would then declare war back on them, and at this point, any land that is taken by one of these kingdoms would just be retaken, as the citizens of that village that was taken would simply revolt. Because of this, there was a sort of unstable, chaotic neutrality between all of the kingdoms. They were very distrusting of one another, and they would not engage in trade or even most forms of communication either. Iron walls separated the villages and acted as the borders between each of the kingdoms, and every kingdom remained completely anonymous. But one day, this would soon have to change, as deep inside of the middle mountain that acted as the center of the entire island, if we look in there, there appears to be some form of creature, a skeleton wielding a sword at that, whose name is Herbert. Herbert's the far gone to be specific. He had many traits, many godlike traits, giving him absurd amounts of power and health, stamina, all of that. But who really is this Herb fellow? It wouldn't matter for the time being, as the legend of Herbert in these kingdoms was simply a legend. Herb was an urban legend, a folktale whose name had been forgotten over the generations, and currently the name Herbert was only a word used to scare little children. Well, two of these children, named Todd and Grace, would hear about these rumors, and despite being both unimaginably young, their irresponsible parents let them go venture off into the mountains to try to see if they can find Herb. They had heard in the stories that Herb had been trapped deep within the center mountain, and despite having no formal experience, these kids were small enough to maneuver their way through the middle of the mountain. As they got deeper in, they both began feeling this intense sense of unease. Grace insisted on just heading back and calling it a day, but Todd felt a need. He felt extreme want to continue heading in. And eventually, they opened the chamber and found Herbert, who was fast asleep, presumably for hundreds of years, thousands maybe. Todd told Grace to go investigate, which he was doing mainly as a joke, as they thought it was just a skeleton. They didn't know he was alive. They didn't even know he was asleep. And after much hazing, Grace eventually did so. Skeleton would wake up, and with his immense speed, he quickly took out Grace, and Todd thought he was next. Luckily, the skeleton seems to have completely ignored Todd and continued moving on as he pushed into the village, causing chaos and disaster to erupt. The village's army quickly found out and began sending their own troops in to try and deal with this weird unknown threat, and the message was quickly relayed to the Queen of the Empire, Dodova, who didn't believe it, as she knew what the consequences meant if Herbert had truly returned. But let me explain what I mean by this. See, as it turns out, Herbert used to be a human. More than that, he used to be a king of a growing empire, and a well-respected king at that. In the great year of 147, the Empire of Shatiria, formerly known as the Empire of Hope, was led by a semi-young leader, and that leader's name was Herbert. It was clear that Herb had been blessed by the gods in some sort of ways, as he had immortality. He was attractive, he was quick and fast, he had a lot of good traits, but in the grand scheme of things, he didn't have all of them. He was a fairly humble dude. He was well respected among his community, and he was seen as a great leader among his kingdom. That's why he was chosen to be the leader, democratically, and they called him Herbert the Young because he still had vibrant blonde hair despite being well over 100 years old. And he ruled over his empire not with an iron fist, but with a heart of love, as he was a benevolent leader that was well respected, and he insisted on helping expand the empire across the island to bring as many people into this world as possible, so that they could live amazing lives under his rule. A great and noble cause. However, Herb's gifts from the god began stacking up, and he began getting more and more of them as time progressed, which suddenly began corrupting the young leader. As around 200 years had passed, and the Empire of Hope had spread across the entire island now, covering all the biomes and uniting everyone. However, it was no longer called the Empire of Hope. It was called the Herbonian hegemony, which many considered to be very narcissistic and egotistical. Furthermore, Herb was no longer a democratically elected leader. Elections had not been held in over 100 years, and last time they were rigged in his favor, as he lost the popular vote to a different candidate. But Herb continued to persist. His gifts and traits from God continued to stack up. At this point, he now had tens of thousands of health, magical powers, stamina. People began looking at him differently. They no longer called him Herbert the Young, but Herbert the Corrupted, a name that upset him to a very large degree. He'd become tyrannical almost. He started ruling with an iron fist. But most of his villages and his armies were too scared and also really too weak to do anything about it. And they just lived in fear, hoping that one day Herb would never snap, as they knew what he would be capable of. But one day, the worst came to fruition, and Herb did snap. And many of the people that you are looking at right now, out of these 3,400, in as soon as 2 years, would no longer be here. As soon as Herb snapped, thousands were gone in an instant. Just 2 years later, the Herbonian hegemony was down to just 1,000 people. But Herb was no longer anywhere in sight. Well, that's because he had gone mad. But more than that, he'd finally been exiled to the center of the map. And the reason this was possible was because the stand-in leader of the Herbonian hegemony, a young lady named Vlamiva, was reading text and discovered a powerful secret. See, across the map, ancient monoliths were located in each of the 3 main biomes. One right here, and lastly, one down here in the south. Once these monoliths were connected, they could summon a divine power that could help rid the world of an evil, and that evil was Herb. But in this case, even the mythical power was not able to truly destroy Herb, at least not in his human form, as the divine power was only capable of sentencing him into the middle chamber. This is where Herb would be trapped for hundreds of years, and the remaining citizens hoped and prayed that he was never to be released. However, due to the dwindling population numbers caused by Herb and his rampage, all 9 of the main villages of the kingdom of the island began feeling very separate from one another, specifically in groups of 3. 3 villages of Profia, Goda, and Cain wanted to remain with the Herbonian hegemony. The 3 villages of Grizz, Maplobia, and Nortrod wanted to go form their own kingdom. And lastly, the kingdom of Shafir Sphere, Costa, and Westgolo wanted to be independent but united together. And simply because the 3 powerful southern villages, nothing left, just didn't have enough military might or even population to deal with it, they had to give in. This would eventually lead to the creation of the kingdoms that we see today. At this point, years had passed and many had forgotten about Herb. But as we had seen, he was back and ready to fight. Like I had said, Herb had become an urban legend, but it was clear more than ever that he was real now. He began mowing through soldiers. While his kills in the bottom only displayed 20 or 30, the fire from his flamesword had killed far more than that, as population numbers of Profia began plummeting. At first, the Queen Dodova of the Empire of Shatiria only permitted the army to go in and try and deal with Herbert. A realization was quickly made that more than just the army was necessary. Due to the hatred between the 3 other kingdoms that had developed over the 150 years, she did not want to call on them for help, and she would rather sacrifice her own kids than call on them for help, and that's exactly what she did. As it was clear that Herb was really only strengthening in power, more needed to be done. Queen Dodova called on every available man, woman, child to try and fight Herb, but it would only result in the population of her country plummeting down to less than half of what it was. At this point, Dodova was aging, and she was no longer concerned with her own pride about these silly matters, and she quickly made a call on the 2 other kingdoms of Wagogia and Neruga for help. Much to her dismay, the hatred between these kingdoms still remained. They did not even believe that Herbert was a real threat, and they laughed at her as they denied her request for help. But soon, at the request of Dodova, both Wagogia and Niroga eventually reluctantly agreed to send a small force in to see Herb firsthand, in which they were shocked, to say the least. Soon after, Dodova eventually died, and the two kingdoms, Wagogia and Niroga, quickly realized that she was not playing some sort of trick on her, and that the world truly was in danger. At first, the two kingdoms were just going to try and secure themselves, make sure that they were okay. But after seeing how that went for the Empire of Shiteria at first, they realized that they were going to have to get over their menial differences and actually work together if they wanted even a chance at taking down Herbert. Three kingdoms officially made an alliance named the Herb Accord, with the sole goal of taking down Herbert. As their first act of business, they realized it would take everyone to take down Herb. So in three separate motions, from the south, Shiteria had gathered every remaining person that it had. On the right, Niroga had gathered every person that they could. In the left, Wagogia had grabbed everyone that they could too, in an effort to finally take down Herb. Battle was long, intense, and resulted in a lot of destruction. However, we need to remember that Herb was a very smart man. As he noticed a large army far off in the corner, he used some of his magical powers to drop a bomb on them. That bomb was called the Sar Bomba, and eradicated nearly everyone within its sight. The entire population of the world was now down to just a couple hundred, and it looked like Herb, who was relatively unaffected by the bomb, would reign supreme. All three kingdoms weren't sure what to do now, and the alliance between the three countries quickly broke up as Wagogia and Niroga quickly began only protecting their self-interests and trying to lock their kingdoms away from Herbert. But looking at a last-ditch effort, a young lady named Alargova, just 8 years old, began reading, and she began reading about her culture. Within her culture, there were a lot of books, and as you can see from here from the bottom, many of these books were written by Herbert the Young, or at least Herbert when he was still called Herbert the Young. And one of these books is called Legends, and she had no clue that this book was written by the same Herbert that they were fighting. But in that book, Herbert described an ancient evil. Herbert said that an ancient evil would descend on the world in the next few hundred years, and that there was only one way to contain that evil, by uniting the three monoliths. The three monoliths had been located across the map. They had lain dormant for hundreds of years, but mysteriously, as soon as Herb escaped, they began emanating a red glow from time to time, which interested and almost weirded out the nearby civilians, but at this point they were too concerned with Herb to really even care. But Olagarva insisted to the other kings that they had to activate and connect their monoliths, and surprisingly, despite their differences over this whole conflict, these three kingdoms had actually gained better relations with one another, and they began being more peaceful on each other's terms. So, naturally, Wagogia activated their monolith, and Niroga did the same with theirs. But there was just one issue. There was barely anyone left in the Empire of Shiteria, and those who were left had no clue how to activate the monolith. And, even if they wanted to, Herbert quickly began moving south towards it, protect it, knowing that it was his only chance to stay in power. Herb began defending it with his life, and it would take a sacrifice to activate it. And then here comes our hero. A young boy that we had met much earlier, named Todd, would go in to save the species. He had regretted his whole life up to this point what had happened to Grace. He knew that it was his fault. He should not have pushed her. And now was his time to make it right. Despite the threat of Herb, he had to avoid him narrowly, as Herb was wreaking havoc to the villages. He began pushing around him, making a mad dash for the monolith, which he did. But as soon as he did it, he was slain by Herbert. But had he done it? He had. The monolith quickly began emanating a violent shade of red and exploded. Once the final monolith was activated, Herbert was finally sent back into the center of the mountain. Now the mountain resembled something like an arena, which confused Herbert, and even he didn't quite understand what was going on. That was until Crabzilla arose. Crabzilla quickly used his power and his stature to try and destroy Herb, who wasn't easy to go. Eventually Crabzilla positioned himself right on top of Herb, and Herbert was killed. The ordeal had taken many years, killed thousands, but thanks to the bravery and cowardice of Todd, humanity was able to prevail. Shortly after the conflict, unlike the last time the world had nearly been destroyed by Herb, instead of splitting up, the three kingdoms made an alliance named the Friendship. They would work together through this to repair and fix the world. Herb may have taken a lot, but he also revealed a lot about what they should be doing, about what they did right and what they did wrong. But finally, after hundreds of years, Herb was finally gone, and the world was once again at peace.